Alright, let's talk about resistance for a second. Now, to give you kind of a good example and put into kind of lamest terms, if you may not be as proficient in car audio as most of us are in the industry and their terminology, I say picture an athlete running around a track, say he does 4 laps, does a whole mile, and then someone walks up and says, here, breathe through this straw. He's going to have a hard time getting all that air into his lungs to be efficient enough to, be respiratory. So, trying to breathe through a tiny little straw, it's not going to be easy because you're not able to let enough air through that hole. Now, say he runs the same amount, goes another mile around the track, someone hands him a pipe, 4-inch tube, and they say breathe through this same length. He can breathe through it a lot more because there's a lot more open area. It allows for more air to flow through. Same thing with water through a garden hose. You can allow more water if the hose is slightly bigger. Now that's the exact same thing when it comes to wire. If you have a bigger wire, you can move more electrons from one point to the next than if you have a smaller wire. Now when it comes to resistance, that's the issue with moving electrons. If you don't have enough conductive surface area, then it's going to slow that movement of electrons when there's a demand on the other side of it trying to get more power through that wire. What that does is it creates resistance, and that builds up heat. So resistance and heat pretty much go hand in hand. The more resistance you have, the more capability of heat rise you have as well. Through wire, through electronics, that's just science. So if we have a larger gauge wire and we are able to transfer more electrons, then we're going to have less resistance. There's going to be much more conductive area. If we have a smaller wire of smaller quality, it's obviously not going to translate into the same thing. So that's one thing you got to think about when it comes to length. So if you need a proper length to your wire from front to back of the vehicle, then that may actually affect the resistance and the amount of conductivity as well. So if you have 24 foot of wire, it's going to have a little more resistance than if you have 18 foot of wire. So that's also going to be something you want to counter as against the size, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we've talked about a lot of resistance, power, conductivity, and materials of wire with power wire and how that acts with your amplifier. Let's talk about signal wire. So having speaker wire for your amplifier. Now, this works in the same way. It carries heat, it conducts heat. The more resistance you have, the more heat. Now, there's not as much power that's going to be running through, so you're going to have as much current draw through a speaker wire than you are through an amplifier power wire. So you're not going to have to worry so much, so you don't have to go with outrageously huge wire. Most of the time, any general installation, you're going to be totally fine with anything under 14 gauge. Now, if we're talking about wiring up subs and wiring them up into lower impedance to where you have maybe a 0.5 ohm or 1 ohm, then you're going to have a little more heat. So that's just general rule of thumb is the more resistance, the more heat. As you lower your impedance, the more resistance you have, the more heat it may produce, the larger the wire should be. So, if you're running 415s in a wall, it's possible you might want to go with like some 4 gauge, wire to run from sub to sub, from your amp to subs. Do what you got to do, just to be safe. But in most general installations, you can get away with anything under 14 gauge. You're going to want to use the same rules when it comes to looking for your speaker wire. Look for OFC. You're going to want to make sure that the jacketing is going to be nice and flexible. It's not going to be just hard, cheap jacketing, and it's not going to be easy to pierce. Now, when it comes to running factory speaker wire and using aftermarket speakers, that's one big debate that many people have. Do I need to run new wire? Can I just use the factory wire? It kind of depends. If you're amplifying your system, I would say you'd want to use aftermarket speaker wire, but it also depends on can you get aftermarket speaker wire through the Molex plug in your door or not. Now, most speaker wire that you're going to find in vehicles is going to be about 18 gauge, give or take. Most of it is going to be OFC, not all of it. Some of it you'll see will corrode very quickly, and I would assume is going to be CCA. Now, when we're talking about running your speaker wire from your amplifier output to your speakers and using the factory speaker wire, that's a hard one because many times people will run speaker wire to the plug up front behind the stereo from the trunk, and then out to the speaker door speakers from there. So, I mean, you could end up with 30 to 50 foot per channel of speaker wire going through 18 gauge. So if you're going to up your power to your speakers, then I would assume you might want to up your wire. I mean, when it comes to using those factory wires, that's just entirely up to you. You know, ease of installation. If you're not really putting that much power to it, like I said, I'm going to have a lot of charts, so go ahead and read the blog. Make sure you find those charts so that you can figure out what copper and how big of wire and length that your power would translate into. What would be the most efficient route for you to go. When it comes to the length of the wire, you may have to climb into the vehicle, take a tape measure, and plan your route and add up all of the footage to see how far you're going to have to take your wire from battery to amplifier, from amplifier to speaker. So plan those out, and then you'll know exactly what length you're ordering when you're shopping, and then you'll kind of have a good idea on what size to buy off of what we're learning here today.